got 3 more bills I'm going to go through. I'm going to take 2 of these together. One had to do with the Virginia Education Savings Account Program. This was very similar to what you've seen in places like Arizona, New Hampshire, where they're basically, it's dollars following students. If you follow, Corey DeAngelis and those guys, that's what we were trying to do. I had a bill drafted for this. Phil Scott had a bill for this. Glenn Davis had a bill for this. There was another bill that was drafted, but quite frankly, not a lot of work had been put into it, and so it had some real problems. But this one, we couldn't get a single Democrat vote, and we actually struggled to get some Republican votes on this one. And so, and that's frustrating.
Yeah.
But we kind of knew there was going to be some fights on that one. The vast majority of us were on board with some sort of dollars follow the students program. Now, I will say I had some people get mad at me like, why did you support this version instead of that version? I'm like, well, here's where we're at. That version had a $480 million fiscal impact, which means we wouldn't have been able to get out of appropriations because we wouldn't have been able to do the tax cuts or any of the other stuff we were doing. Secondly, we actually have homeschool groups that oppose dollars following students unless you have some barriers in between homeschool and them. So the bill that ended up going forward, or was supposed to go forward, got out of committee, was the one that said if you leave public school, a certain portion of dollars will then follow you to where you go next. Well, a lot of people said, well, you just cut out private school kids and you just cut out homeschool kids. And I said, I get it. We want everybody to be able to participate. And technically you could. If you enrolled your kid in a public school for a semester, you could then qualify and do the whole thing. But they would get mad at me like, oh, you're being a squish on this. I'm like, no, I'm not, because I need a bill that we can all vote on. And we have major homeschool groups in Virginia that will not support this. They will even go to the degree of showing up and testifying against it. And then I'm going to lose Republican votes on this. So this is the mechanism we have to go in order to get something in place. And then we can talk about what's the best way to implement it over time. But anyways, that one died.
Can I clarify that real quick? Yeah. Had you gone with the perfect bill, it wouldn't have even had a chance to be voted on.
It would not have even gotten out of subcommittee.
Okay.
It wouldn't even, in fact, it actually had an opportunity to testify in full committee, and it got torn to shreds because not only did it have this huge fiscal impact, but the patron hadn't even put in a budget amendment to cover the fiscal impact. Like it's just understood that if I say, hey, I'm asking for $480 million, then I'm going to submit a budget amendment saying this legislation is going forward, and should it pass, here's my budget amendment to make sure that we can pay for it. Did it even do that? Like, that's basic.
And the whole reason that we have this process is because, unlike the federal government, we have to balance the state budget every year. And this is the case for the vast majority of states out there, for the audience that's listening. That the good news is that when the inevitable debt crisis hits, the states will be relatively well off, except for the states that rely mostly on federal aid. But what shocks me the most, and I think this is something that a lot of our audience members will get some value from, is that let's say that you listen to making the argument because you enjoy the way that Nick can break down many of these issues, especially when the left tackles them on anything. It could be anything from life to guns to taxes to education, anything in between. The problem that we see a lot as conservative activists, and everybody who's at this table probably has had some experience on this. Nick has done this for years. I've seen this on both the legislative side and the political side for many, many years, is that there's so many cats to herd in a state house, so many different competing interest groups. And even when you're the most conservative person in the room, there's always some other group or organization that will come there that for whatever reason, they will oppose your bill, even if they're theoretically on your side. There's so many groups out there, and they work in both directions. We've talked about this before. There's some groups out there that all that they want is just to make money.
Yeah.
And they will present themselves as the most conservative people in the room, but they're actually doing damage to the cause in order to help themselves and make themselves seem like they're way further to the right of everybody else. And then there's, on the other hand, there's the squish groups. They actually give cover to the bad guys because they will never take a position on anything remotely controversial, but they have here's an example for many years. This varies by state, but there's some states out there that for many years, the NRA was the one that was killing constitutional carry. For many, many years in certain states out there, they were the ones doing it. Now, in other states, the NRA was actually good. It varied by state chapter.
It's kind of on board now.
But that's just one example, right? So you have these like two issues within the conservative movement when it comes to pushing good legislation. You have grifters on one hand, and you have these like establishment fake conservatives on another hand. And in some ways, they work hand in hand to stop good legislation from being passed.
And here's an interesting one, because I got two more bills. I'm going to go through this quick because these last two shouldn't be controversial. So the first three we did, I would argue that the first one on explicit material shouldn't be controversial, but evidently it was. The second one I totally get. That's probably gonna split along party lines. The third one I just talked about also split along party lines because the Democrats want the government to control education. The next two we have, the first one was division laboratory schools. Glenn Davis had this, HB 2490. He wanted something where we could remove some of the different barriers that we have and allow for greater innovation. And he recognized that the only way he could get like the Virginia Education Association and others to come in and help with this is that if he focused it pretty much almost entirely just on the public school system. So the government still has some sort of say, but he was going to allow for greater innovation within the lab schools. However, going through it, under his program, there were certain private institutions that already had existing contracts that he didn't want to mess with. And so he had to amend the bill. Immediately lost support. I mean, he actually had a bill that the VEA was willing to get up and support because all the emphasis was put on public schools. And the moment he had to allow for some sort of private institutions to be able to participate as well, the VEA changed their mind and the bill died in a subcommittee.
You want to talk about bad groups on the left? I mean,
my God.
Again, a lot of conservatives that are in office, they have personal examples of having bad blood with groups on the right, but there's also groups that we haven't even talked about groups on the left. And the left dominates these. There's only a handful of groups on the right. There's a million groups on the left, and they have way more power and money and influence and institutional backing.
And all of the thing you need to understand is that all of the groups with the most benign sounding names, right? Like when you hear
what the phrase is,
when you
Nick?
hear wait a second, when you hear the name Family Foundation, you probably know that's a conservative group. When you hear the National Rifle Association or the Virginia Citizens Defense League, you know that's a conservative group. It's when the School Board Association backs every single left-wing play.
There's a quote. I don't know if it came from Morton Blackwell, but there was somebody that from that network, very conservative network here in Virginia, and I heard it at my previous job. There's this quote that has stuck with me for a long time, which is, if the name does not, if there's not a conservative sounding word in the name of the organization, it's a left-wing group. A good example is, an organization that I worked with for many years, not literally worked with, but worked alongside, was National Association for Gun Rights. Pretty obvious they're on the right with the name, right? Yeah. VEA, Virginia Education Association, it's a benign name. Yep. The advice that I will give you, and it doesn't work 100% of the time, but it works 90% of the time, is if the organization has a conservative word in the name, guns or life or something like that, again, you need to verify and make sure they're not one of those two bad groups that we talked about earlier, but they're probably at least presenting on the right. If they have a benign name and Virginia, they're almost always to a T to the left.
Yeah. No, and that's, again, that's I'm sorry, that's been my lived experience.
Yeah. VACO is another example.
Oh yeah, Virginia Association of Counties.